Hello and welcome to this video, and in this video we're going to have a deeper look at one of the greatest jazz fusion albums of all time, which is this, The Inner Mountain Flame by Mahavishnu Orchestra. I'm a drummer. I'm a huge John McLaughlin and Mahavishnu Orchestra fan. I set this YouTube up many years ago to put my drum videos on and bits and bobs like that. In May this year I started to put up videos where I talk about prog, jazz fusion, sometimes a little bit of rock. And the interest in John McLaughlin on this YouTube has been immense, and have been asked to do more videos about John McLaughlin. I've done a ranking of the Mahavishnu Orchestra albums, and I've gone through all John McLaughlin's solo albums. But I thought I haven't yet covered the Mahavishnu Orchestra albums in enough depth, which is what I'm about to do. I'm going to go through them all one by one, and this is the first video where we look at this absolute beast. But it's also prompted by a lot of comments that have come off my ranking video for the Mahavishnu Orchestra, where I didn't put this album at number one. I think I put Birds of Fire at number one, and I also rated very highly Visions of the Emerald Beyond. So I can't quite remember the rankings. You'll have to go back and have a look at what I actually did, but I'm pretty sure this came in at number 3. And of course, this is beloved amongst Mahavishnu Orchestra fans. And so I have had a lot of messages saying, you're completely wrong and this should have been number 1, which I actually understand. There's an undercurrent of, you don't understand the Mahavishnu Orchestra, you haven't thought about it, you don't know how brilliant this album is. And I thought that I needed to counter as well. By just talking about how important this album is to me personally and to jazz fusion. So this album is the first Mahavishnu Orchestra album by the first classic lineup, which is John McLaughlin, Billy Cobham, Jan Hammer, Rick Laird and Jerry Goodman. It was recorded, I think, in August 1971. The band had formed before that and had done some gigs, I think, or they'd definitely been in quite a lot of rehearsals before they went into the studio in August. And it was released in November 1971. Now, I would argue that this is the first fully fledged, proper jazz fusion album, right? That is how much I rate this album, okay? So why didn't I put it at number 1? The reason is because I also rate the band so highly. If I thought that they'd done everything on the first album and everything was downhill from there, we wouldn't be talking about the greatest band of all time. But we are. We are talking about the greatest band of all time here. And the ideas that John McLaughlin and the rest of them set out on this album, he then advanced as far as I'm concerned, really laying the spine of jazz fusion, from which all the other bands hung off. All right. So, little bit about the making of this album before I get into its impact. John McLaughlin is a British guitarist. He'd learnt his trade in London when the whole rock and progressive rock movement was happening with Hendrix and Cream and the Yardbirds. He'd been around all that. You know, he was a guitarist that was equally at home in jazz, in rock, in R&B and blues. He was equally at home in all those areas. He was a musician that wants to fuse music. Then uniquely for a British musician, he gets the call to go to America, and he joins the Tony Williams Lifetime, which is a seminal early fusion band, and he also records with Miles Davis, who is also pioneering jazz fusion. But I would argue that Miles and Tony Williams and Gary Burton and Larry Coryell and Free Spirits and all those bands that had come before, although they made great strides in exploring how to fuse jazz and rock, right? I think what we know as jazz rock fusion, which really falls into sort of 2 camps really. One is the funky dance music type of jazz fusion that ends up with Fuse Jack, Middle of the Road, George Benson. I love George Benson, by the way, Breezy's a mate now. But there's that line of the funky, and then there's a sort of prog jazz rock, which would be Mahavishnu Orchestra, Return to Forever, 11th House, and all that sort of stuff. Now, Mahavishnu Orchestra primarily really laid the groundwork for that second type of jazz fusion, which we could call jazz rock. right? This is incredibly influential because through those bands, this then goes on to really influence heavy metal, for example. You know, so there's a little bit of the Mavish Orchestra in Van Halen. There's a little bit of the Mavish Orchestra in Metallica, I believe. So that influence is immense. But also, I think this is a very, very funky album. The funk R&B thing is there with jazz fusion quite early on. If you were to listen to Fat Albert Rotunda by Herbie Hancock, that's a straight fusion album that's really funky. Made around the same time of this, if not a little bit before. You know, Bitches Brew, it's abstract, but it's funky. The funky side of jazz had been explored, but the actual fusing of what rock music was doing, especially progressive ideas from Led Zeppelin, from Hendrix, from Cream, that wasn't taken on board as much. And that is the really important factor that makes this album so important. The second thing is you could hear John McLaughlin trying to do that on Devotion. You could hear Miles trying to do it on Jack Johnson, but I don't think they really solved it fully. This is where it gets solved fully. This is where it is laid down in a way where you can go, right, that does everything that jazz fusion does, right? You have the improvisatory aspect of jazz fused with the immediacy and excitement of rock. You know, that's the one thing. But there's other things in jazz fusion, or that we associate jazz with fusion. That would be things like using on time signatures. Now, of course, Brubeck had explored that. Then Don Ellis had taken it further. But the way jazz fusion explores time signatures is by dividing the time additively, right? So rather than cutting the time up with crotchets and breaking it down that way, it's almost like Indian music where you're building the music up in blocks, a 5, 5 and a 3. You see, that would be equal to, say, 13. So rather than thinking in 13/8, you're thinking in groups of 5, 5 and 3. Now, why did this come about? Okay, so I think it's a perfect storm, really. And I think one of the problems that has always been a bit of a cloud over John McLaughlin's career, I'm going to be contentious now, but he's really apparent with the Mavish Orchestra, is John McLaughlin's a jazz musician. He creates compositions that allows the personalities of the musicians to come in. So I think when he forms the Mavish Orchestra, he actually brings in an incredible lineup of musicians that are all going to bring their personalities in and make a stamp on that music. The Mavish Orchestra is not the product of John McLaughlin, it's the product of all of them. All right? I think when he, before he formed the Mavish Orchestra, the first musician he brought in was Billy Cobham. And I think he started jamming with Billy Cobham. And I think Billy Cobham is the guy that really brings in this new way of breaking up time in music. He's been very influential on me. And so you start to look at time signatures from two ends, you know. If we take a track like Birds of Fire, right, off Birds of Fire, that's in basically 9/8, or you could call it 9/4. I would call it 9/8. So I would see it in 9/8, and the drums are playing in 9/8, and they're divided up into 3/8, 3/8, 3/8. But the guitars are, how would they be divided up? It's off the top of my head now. The guitars are playing in groups of like 5/16, 5/16, 5/16, and then 3/16, and they're meshed together in that way. Okay, that's a much more complex way of feeling time. It's almost like you're in two times at the same time. Well, Billy Cobham's the guy that brings that in. When you hear John McLaughlin flirting with these ideas on Devotion, Buddy Miles is not the drummer to do that. And Buddy Miles plays four square through all of it. But Cobham's got this way of breaking up time, which I think is really, really important. He's also got a sort of machine gun-like approach to the drums, where he's really pushing the band forward. He's playing in front of the beat and driving the band with these sort of really fast machine gun-like rolls, which I think is also becomes one of the important blueprints for jazz fusion. So that's Cobham's influence, and that's right in from the start. So with the In Amount of Flame, what we have is an album that's primarily in its infancy, if you like, created between the guitar and the drums. I think if you listen to a lot of those compositions, you start to hear that. That's really interesting. Guitar and drums has featured in jazz in the organ trios with Wes Montgomery, Jack McDuff, Jimmy Smith. And of course, that's been a big influence on McGofflin. He's grown up with those bands, and he's experimented with those forms with Tony Williams. No bass player, think about it. So you're really creating structure at how the guitar relates to the drums. And John McGofflin solved that by using a sort of arpeggiated guitar structure, which crops up over and over again on this album and on the later albums. Into the mix, he brings his old mate Rick Laird, the great Rick Laird, who sadly died earlier this year, who doesn't get the credit he's due. But Rick Laird was a master musician. He understood jazz inside out. This is a guy that played with Wes Montgomery, he'd played with Sonny Rollins. He's an upright jazz player, and he knows the form inside out. But he's also an experimental jazz player. But what's interesting about Rick Laird, he's not a showboating bassist like Jaco Pastorius or Stanley Clarke. That band would have been ruined with a bass player like that. There had to be some fundamental anchor to the Mahavishnu Orchestra, because Cobham's not doing it, McGofflin's not doing it, the rest of them aren't doing it. So Rick Laird he's got the ability to traverse these charts. You've got to understand, when the Mahavishnu Orchestra was formed, I've read stories of other musicians seeing the charts and going, well, I can't even read this, I can't get my head around this, what's that time signature and how's that, Laird had the ability to work within that framework and yet create an anchor point, for the music. Really, really important. So there's the third element we have in. And then he brings in these two instrumentalists, Jan Hammer and Jerry Goodman. Now, Jan Hammer is again a fully fledged jazz virtuoso. This guy had been playing piano with Sarah Vaughan before he joined the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Jan Hammer was a virtuoso musician, grew up in communist Czechoslovakia, and really jazz got him out of that country. To him, the whole American dream, that whole idea must be so important to him because it changed his life. It took him to America, and he ended up playing with his heroes, and he truly is a master jazz musician. He is equal to McGofflin, I think, in terms of vision. And I think he wants to take the piano way beyond what it's done before in jazz. And his influence, like John McGofflin, is coming from Indian music. And he wants to know how to play a piano, a keyboard, like an Indian improvising musician would. And he's listening to them, and he's copying those licks. On the Inner Mountain Flame, he hasn't quite been able to solve that problem, right? So he's playing electric piano, he's often overdriving it, he's often playing it through ring modulation, and I don't know how he does this, but he's got some sort of effect where he can primitively bend the notes on the piano. His electric piano playing on this is absolutely sublime. It is in no way compromised by him not having the Moog there. It's incredible playing. Signature playing, some of the greatest electric piano playing ever. But I feel that he's got more to go. Right? The same thing with Cobham. Right? But we'll come back to that in a bit. Let's just get on to Jerry Goodman. Jerry Goodman is a really interesting musician. He is almost like he's the speck of dirt in the oyster that makes the pearl. He's not necessarily a jazz player. The rest of them all are. They could sat and play bebop jazz. Jerry Goodman's not. Jerry Goodman started out as a virtuoso classical violin player. His parents had played in symphony orchestras. He'd grown up in that. He really understood the charts and the structures that McGofflin was playing. But he's also the rock and roll element. I can remember when I first got into the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and I was looking at pictures of them and considering whether I should buy the album, and seeing Jerry Goodman with the long hair looking like the ultimate hippie with that electric violin. That was the coolest thing I'd ever seen, and I think that was a part of what made it attractive to me, and it must have been for so many other people, because he is the psychedelic rock guy as well. He's a classical violinist, and you can hear that in his execution right? But he's also plays like Jimi Hendrix. He's the Jimi Hendrix element in that band. But he's got something else going on in there as well. Jerry Goodman, I think, has got a signature sound on the violin. Absolutely, should be up there. Always mentioned with Ponte, Grappelli, you know, Jerry Goodman. I think his sound is so important. His ability to traverse these time signatures. You've got to understand these charts are so difficult that these musicians are having to do something that no one's ever done before. By 1975, most decent drummers would be able to play 19, you know, because of the Mavish Nuksha, but who the hell had played in 1916 time, right? So, if we go through the track list here, right, Meeting of the Spirits, really interesting track. It heralds a new beginning. So often in music, the tracks that have brought in new genres sound like a fanfare. If you think of Irving Berlin, like come on here, come on here, come on here, you know, that ragtime band, I can't remember the title. That is a real heralding track. Rock Around the Clock is a heralding track. You know, Firestarter by The Prodigy is a heralding track. It's announcing something. And in those chords on Meeting of the Spirits, we can hear the announcement that something's about to happen. And it really does. And the Meeting of the Spirits is a track that really defines the Mahavishnu Orchestra sound, which is that sort of double time feel, you know, tune times at the same time, the arpeggiating, the dark chords with loads of minor seconds, and the inferring of sort of weirder scales, you know, and the sort of Indian based improvisation, you know. It's followed up by Dawn. Dawn could be my favourite track on here, and I read a review this morning preparing for this, and they mentioned all the tracks except Dawn, but I think Dawn's absolutely incredible. And it does what happens later on Open Country Joy. It starts off very mellow and then builds up and goes berserk. How do you follow up going that berserk? With the Noonwood Race, which is absolutely berserk. You know, and that really harks back to stuff that I can hear him doing in the Miles Davis group, and also the influence of Hendrix. And of course we close side one with A Lotus on the Irish Streams, which is that other aspect, the really pointillistic, you know, spacey, ethereal sound that the Mavish Nuksha can do, you know, which always gets overlooked. You know, people will just talk about them in one way and never admit that they also, you know, made some of the most exquisite, full of space music, full of, you know, subtlety on those little acoustic things that they did. On side two, it opens up with Vital Transformation, which is in 9/8, and you've got that Cobham way of dividing the time. He's doing that all over. And then, of course, we've got Dancer Mayer. And Dancer Mayer is that track which is heavier than any heavy metal record, right? There's heavy metal in the Mavish Nuksha. Black Sabbath have come out in 1970, and they've invented heavy metal. By 1971, the Mavish Nuksha made the heaviest track of all time, which is Dancer Mayer, you know, which is beyond heavy metal. Then we have You Know, which became a live staple. Again, really exploring that the timings, and we finished with one of the most brutal tracks ever recorded, Awakening, which is famous, if you don't know, because the solos, each solo is based upon the astrological sign of each band member. I think that's correct. So yeah, absolutely incredible. So I hope I've argued that this is one of the most important fusion albums of all time. You know, it really brings it's probably the first fully fledged fusion album. You know, then, you know, it takes another 2 years to Return to Forever to catch up. You know, it takes a few years for Larry Corr with 11th House to catch up. Weather Report in 1971 is still trying to explore the ideas that Miles Davis had done on In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew. And it's going to take them around about till 1975 to really work out how to play fusion. And that's going to be informed by The Headhunters in 1973, when Herbie Hancock really nails how to bring the funk in. And of course the Mavish Nuksha. I think I've gone through very quickly the defining moments in fusion. And as you can see right at the start, it's here. Yes, Tony Williams' Lifetime's messing around with this stuff. Gary Burton's group's got bits of it. Miles has got it. But I think this is the first time it's really nailed. So why didn't I put it in number 1? Well, it's because of a couple of things. I think the compositional ideas that are on here are taken further forward even more on the later albums. So things that I hear on Meeting the Spirits, he's advanced further on Birds of Fire. Things I've heard on Vital Transformation, The Way of Playing Time, he's taken further than on Celestial Terrestrial Commuters. And also on, say, A Lotus on Irish Streams, that acoustic track, he's taken further on Thousand Island Park. So I think that's part of it. And we'd be selling the band short to say they, didn't do anything after this. Also, we're missing the Moog, which I think is integral to the Mavic Orchestra sound, and Billy Cobham, A, being recorded properly, and B, having the double bass drums. It's those elements. There's more to come with this band. So anyway, I feel like I've spoken enough about this. I don't want to go any further because there's more to say, and I might revisit it another time. But I hope this little excursion into the Mavic Orchestra has been entertaining, and I'll see you soon on the next video. Thank you very much.